At 4 o'clock in the morning on July 5, 1943, somewhere south of the Kursk salient, a German tank commander sat inside a steel box that smelled of oil, sweat, hot metal, and stale tobacco. Outside, the land was still half dark. The fields ahead looked almost peaceful, broken only by low ridgelines, patches of brush, and the faint shape of Soviet earthworks disappearing into the gray. Inside the tank, nothing was peaceful. The engine trembled beneath the crew like an animal trying to break loose. The metal floor vibrated under their boots. A headset crackled with half-heard orders, static, clipped voices, and the strained calm of men trying to sound certain before sunrise. Somewhere behind them, artillery had begun to speak. Not one gun, not a battery, a whole horizon of guns. The night flashed white, then orange, then white again, and every flash made the inside of the tank blink for a fraction of a second. The crew had been told the same thing many times. The Soviets had prepared. Of course they had prepared. Everyone knew that. But preparation was not the same as stopping a German armored attack. The panzers had crossed borders, smashed armies, rolled through countries, and turned maps into memories. At Kursk, the commanders believed they were about to recover something Germany had lost after Stalingrad. Movement, initiative, command over events. They believed that if enough armor struck one place with enough force, the Soviet front would crack. The driver leaned forward. His hands tightened on the controls. In the commander's sight, the world ahead was still mostly shadow. No faces, no clear targets, no visible enemy, just earth. Then the column began to move. Tracks bit into the ground. Engines rose together, one after another, until the field seemed to growl. The first vehicles pushed forward through lanes marked by engineers, past trampled grass and scattered debris from the night's bombardment. The men inside could not see much, but they could feel the promise of weight. Armor, guns, momentum, and then, ahead of them, the ground opened with a flat, violent crack. The tank stopped. Not dramatically, not like in a newsreel. It lurched, shuddered, and froze at an ugly angle, one track torn, smoke curling from beneath its belly. The vehicle behind it slowed. Then another. Someone shouted over the radio. The first report was confused. Mine. Damaged track. Lane blocked. Engineers needed forward. The commander listened, jaw tight, as the voices piled over each other. The attack had begun only minutes before, and already the timetable was bending. This was the first truth of the Hedgehog defense. It did not have to destroy every tank at once. It only had to stop the first one in the wrong place. German commanders had looked at fixed defenses before and seen something old-fashioned. Strongpoints, trenches, mines, guns hidden in the dirt. They had seen a static answer to a mobile war. To them, a defense that sat in the ground seemed like a thing waiting to be broken. But the battlefield around Kursk was not waiting helplessly. It had been prepared with patience, dug by soldiers and civilians, measured by officers who knew the likely routes of approach, seeded with mines, wired with communications, covered by artillery, reinforced by anti-tank guns placed not just to face forward, but to bite from the side. It was not one wall. It was layer after layer of resistance, each one designed to make the attacker slower, thinner, more nervous, less coordinated. The men in the tanks did not yet understand the full shape of it. They could only feel the first symptoms. A pause. A blocked lane. Smoke from a damaged vehicle. The sudden knowledge that speed had become fragile. Outside, engineers moved forward under shell fire. They carried tools, markers, explosives, and the quiet burden of being needed in the exact place every Soviet gunner was waiting to hit. A man knelt in the dirt, reaching toward the ground with careful fingers while artillery fragments cut the air above him. He was not attacking. He was trying to make it possible for others to attack. Behind him, engines idled. Fuel burned. Crews sweated inside armor. Officers checked watches. The minute hand moved. 1 minute became 5. 5 became more. On a map table, that delay would later look small. In a tank lane under fire, it felt enormous. Every stopped vehicle created another decision. Bypass or wait. Clear or risk. push forward or preserve the formation. Every choice cost time, and time was the first thing the Hedgehog defense was built to steal. The German plan depended on power arriving in rhythm. Tanks, infantry, engineers, artillery, aircraft, all moving in a hard, coordinated blow. But here, in the gray morning outside Kursk, rhythm began to break into fragments. A commander peered through his optics and saw no grand design. Just smoke, dirt, a stopped tank, men moving too slowly, a line of vehicles with nowhere to go. He had been told the Soviets would be stubborn. He had not been told the ground itself would fight. And somewhere ahead, beyond the first mine belt, beyond the first hidden guns, the Real defense was still waiting. What they believed, Blitzkrieg could still break the east. The German high command did not arrive at Kursk as men who had forgotten defeat. Stalingrad was still there, heavy in every room where officers spoke in low voices over maps. North Africa had turned. The Eastern Front had become a wound that would not close. Germany could still fight with terrible strength, but the old feeling, the sense that war could be controlled by speed and will, had been damaged. Operation Citadel was meant to repair that feeling. The Kursk salient bulged westward into German lines like an invitation. On a map, it looked vulnerable. Strike from the north. Strike from the south. Pinch it off. Trap Soviet forces inside. Destroy them. Shorten the front. Restore initiative. Show Germany, the army, and the world that the Panzer Force could still decide the future. It was a clean idea on paper. War often is. Around the map tables, officers could see arrows. They could see divisions. They could see rail lines, roads, assembly areas, and objectives. They could see the shape of victory before the first vehicle moved. What they could not see as clearly was the time they had already given away. The offensive had been delayed. There were reasons. New equipment. Preparation. The desire to gather more strength. Germany wanted to bring heavier armor to the field, machines that seemed to promise an answer to the Soviet mass building in the east. Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinands, vehicles of weight, firepower, and prestige. Machines that looked, in photographs and on paper, like arguments made of steel. To many German commanders, the logic was hard to resist. If the Soviets had learned to absorb earlier blows, then the next blow would have to be heavier. If their defenses were deeper, the spearhead would have to be sharper. If the Red Army had become harder to break, then Germany would concentrate its best remaining tools and break it anyway. That belief had roots in real experience. Blitzkrieg had not been a myth to the men who used it. They had seen enemy armies collapse when communications failed, when headquarters lost contact, when tanks appeared behind lines that were supposed to be secure. The Panzer Arm had given Germany victories so fast that entire governments had seemed to fall behind the pace of its engines. So when they looked at Soviet defenses around Kursk, many German officers did not see an unsolvable problem. They saw an obstacle. Obstacles could be reduced. Minefields could be cleared. Strongpoints could be bypassed. Trenches could be shelled. Anti-tank guns could be crushed. The German army still had trained crews, disciplined officers, experienced engineers, and the memory of how to make a battlefield move. But the Soviets had spent the delay differently. Day after day, while German units prepared, Soviet soldiers dug. Civilians dug. Engineers measured routes, marked fields, built belts, cut trenches, laid mines, dragged guns into positions, camouflaged firing points, connected headquarters, and rehearsed responses. They did not need to guess that armor was coming. They knew armor was coming. They knew the likely directions. They knew the Germans needed speed. So they built a defense to make speed expensive. It is easy, decades later, to imagine this as simple. Men digging trenches. Mines placed in rows. Guns hidden in trees. But for those who built it, this was not simple. It was labor without romance. Hands blistered on shovels. Men slept in holes they had just dug. Women and old men carried earth in baskets. Soldiers marked minefields with care because a mistake could kill their own comrades later. Anti-tank crews learned ranges to landmarks. A tree stump, a burned hut, a rise in the field, a road bend where a tank might briefly show its side. The Germans believed they were preparing an offensive. The Soviets were preparing an environment. That difference mattered. An offensive begins when the commander gives the order. An environment is already working before the first shot. It shapes where men can move, where vehicles must slow, where radios lose contact, where fear begins to spread. The Hedgehog defense was not just a line of men saying no. It was a system designed to make the attacker answer questions he had not planned to answer. Where is the safe lane? Who clears it? How long will that take? What happens when the lead tank burns? Can infantry keep up? Where is the second belt? How many more belts are there? Before the battle, German confidence still had room to breathe. In the assembly areas, crews checked ammunition. Mechanics worked by lamplight. Officers walked past rows of armor and heard engines turning over like proof. Men wrote letters. Some joked. Some were silent. Many had fought long enough to know that no machine made a man safe, but they also knew what their machines could do. The belief was not stupid. That is what makes the story matter. German commanders were not children mistaking wood for stone. They had reasons to trust armor, concentration, training, and shock. They had seen those things work. But at Kursk, the Soviets were not waiting to be surprised. And the longer Germany waited for the perfect blow, the more carefully the Red Army prepared the place where that blow would land. The hidden problem: a tank army needs more than tanks. A tank looks independent from a distance. It moves with its own engine, carries its own gun. It wears its own armor. It crosses open ground with a confidence infantry cannot imitate. In photographs, it seems almost self-contained, a weapon that brings its own answer to danger. Inside a real battle, a tank is never alone. It needs fuel. It needs ammunition. It needs spare parts, recovery vehicles, clear routes, engineers, infantry, artillery coordination, air cover, radio discipline, and commanders who understand what is happening beyond the narrow view of optics and dust. A tank may be made of steel, but an armored attack is made of timing. The Hedgehog defense understood this better than many men who mocked it. A mine did not have to destroy a tiger to matter. Could break a track. Could damage a road wheel. It could stop the lead vehicle in a lane only wide enough for one. A hidden anti-tank gun did not have to wipe out a column. Could force the column to deploy. Deployment took time. Time drew artillery. Artillery pinned infantry. Pinned infantry left tanks exposed. Exposed tanks became cautious. Cautious tanks slowed the attack. Nothing in that chain looked heroic on its own. That was why it worked. The hidden problem in German armor doctrine at Kursk was not that the tank had become useless. It had not. German tanks could still kill. German crews could still fight with discipline and skill. Their guns could still reach out across fields and destroy Soviet positions with frightening precision. But armor built for movement becomes vulnerable when movement is stolen piece by piece. At Kursk, the Soviet defense did not simply stand in front of the Germans. It interfered with the relationships that made German armor powerful. A panzer column needed infantry close enough to clear trenches and protect against close assault. But minefields and artillery could separate infantry from tanks. Engineers were needed to clear mines and obstacles. But engineers under fire moved slowly, and the more they worked, the more visible they became. Commanders needed reports from the front. But smoke, dust, terrain, and radio confusion turned reports into fragments. A unit that seemed strong at dawn could become a collection of separate problems by mid-morning. One vehicle stuck in the wrong place. One engineer team pinned down. One anti-tank gun firing from an angle no one had expected. One officer making a decision from a map that no longer matched the ground. The Soviet strongpoints, the Hedgehogs, were built to survive long enough to cause that kind of disorder. They were not always meant to hold forever. Some would be overrun. Some crews would die where they stood. Some trenches would disappear under shellfire. But before they went silent, they could force the attacker to spend time and attention. That was the hidden arithmetic. German commanders could measure tanks committed. They could measure guns, shells, fuel, and divisions. But the Hedgehog defense dealt in smaller losses that accumulated until the offensive changed character. A delayed company, a confused battalion, a damaged bridge-laying vehicle, a mine-clearing team that did not arrive, a radio net crowded with requests, a commander forced to choose between speed and order. The battlefield became thick. That thickness is hard to capture on a map. A red arrow still moves forward. A line still shifts. A report still says ground was gained. But the men inside the attack feel the truth before headquarters does. They feel it in the stops, in the waiting, in the way the engine idles too long while shells come closer, in the way the driver asks for instructions and no one answers quickly, in the way a crewman stops believing the next field will be easier. The Soviets had learned to fight German armor not by pretending it was weak, but by understanding what made it strong. They knew armor wanted open lanes, so they made lanes dangerous. They knew armor wanted speed, so they built obstacles that turned speed into impatience. They knew armor wanted coordination, so they created conditions where coordination would be hard to maintain. And they knew that even the best tank crew was still human. A man trapped inside steel can be brave, experienced, and well-trained. He can still become tired. He can still become blind from smoke. He can still flinch when a shell hits nearby. He can still wonder whether the next dark patch of earth contains a mine. The German command believed it was facing a defensive position. What it was really facing was a defensive process. That process did not need to win instantly. It only needed to continue. Belt after belt. Strong point after strong point, delay after delay, and hidden inside that process were the underdogs of the battle, men whose names rarely appeared in grand accounts of armored warfare, but whose work determined how far the armor could go. The underdogs, men with mines, guns, and shovels. Before the German engines started, there were shovels. Not one shovel, thousands, striking earth in daylight, in darkness, in rain, under orders, under exhaustion, sometimes in silence because men had become too tired to speak. The defense around Kursk was built by soldiers, engineers, civilians, women, old men, boys not far from soldiering age, and officers whose battlefield was not a dramatic charge but a line measured in meters of trench and boxes of mines. They were not the figures armies usually build myths around. A tank crew could be photographed beside its machine. A fighter pilot could be named, counted, celebrated. A general could stand over a map and later appear in memoirs. But the man who buried an anti-tank mine in the right place often vanished into the ground with his work. If the mine did its job, no one might know his name. If he marked it badly, his own side might pay for it. If he laid it under shellfire, he might never see whether it mattered. The Hedgehog defense was made by such men. A combat engineer might spend the night carrying mines to a field he knew German vehicles would cross at dawn. He had to work carefully, because carelessness could kill him before the Germans arrived. He had to remember spacing, depth, markers, lanes for Soviet movement, and the ugly fact that the enemy would not walk politely into the pattern designed for him. Nearby, infantrymen deepened trenches and scraped firing steps into the walls. Anti-tank crews dragged guns into pits, then covered the evidence with branches, earth, and patience. A gun pit was not comfortable. It was a hole where men waited for machines. The crew knew the sound they were listening for, the distant mechanical rise of engines, the heavier grinding of tracks, the artillery that usually came before armor. They knew that if they fired too early, they might reveal themselves before the shot mattered. If they waited too long, the tank might fire first. In that kind of waiting, courage did not look like shouting. It looked like a man keeping his hand still on a gun mechanism while the ground shook. These men saw what higher command sometimes expressed only in doctrine. They saw that a tank was most dangerous when it was moving confidently and most vulnerable when forced to hesitate. They saw the small angles of a field, the dips in the ground, the route a driver might choose to avoid mud, the place where a vehicle would turn slightly and expose its side. A junior officer with a field glass could understand something no strategic map could show. This patch of earth could become a trap if the gun stayed hidden long enough. The Germans often respected Soviet toughness. But before Kursk, many still believed Soviet defenses could be battered open by organized violence. The old contempt had not fully disappeared, contempt for crude methods, for mass, for fortifications that seemed primitive beside German technical skill. Yet the men with shovels were not trying to impress anyone. They were trying to survive the first day. They were trying to make sure the German tanks did not arrive fresh at the second day, or the third. They were trying to build a battlefield in which the attacker would become tired before the decisive moment. This required no glamour. It required repetition. Dig, carry, lay, cover, mark, check, move the gun, check the range, dig deeper, bring ammunition, camouflage again. At night, the work took on a strange intimacy. Low voices, the scrape of metal in earth, the dull weight of ammunition boxes, the smell of damp soil, somewhere far off artillery. A soldier might pause with his hands on a shovel and look into the dark, knowing that the same field that now felt empty would soon be full of fire. Fear was present, but it did not always announce itself. Sometimes it appeared as irritation, a snapped answer, a hand rubbing tired eyes, a man checking the same mine twice, someone asking quietly whether the Germans would come in the morning. No one needed to answer. The Hedgehog defense depended on ordinary men accepting terrible closeness. Anti-tank guns had to wait until armor came into useful range. Infantry had to remain in positions that might be bypassed. Engineers had to repair obstacles or lay new mines while the battle was already moving. Strongpoints had to keep fighting even when the attacker seemed to flow around them. To an officer looking from above, that might sound like doctrine. To the men inside it, it meant being left in a pocket of earth while tanks passed nearby and artillery searched for them. This was the moral weight of the defense. It asked small groups to hold their nerve long enough to damage a larger machine. It asked them to trust that the system around them would make their sacrifice meaningful. A gun crew might never know whether the tank they disabled delayed a battalion. An engineer might never know whether the mine he laid forced a German column into artillery fire. But the system needed each small act. German commanders believed they were facing defensive lines. What they were really facing was thousands of individual decisions made before dawn by people who would never be famous. And the strangest decision of all was still ahead. The Soviets would not simply try to stop the German spearheads at the first line. In many places, they would let them enter deeper. Not because the defense had failed, because that was where the trap became sharper. The ridiculous idea, let the spearhead come in. On a clean map, penetration looks like failure. A line is drawn. The enemy crosses it. The line is broken. Staff officers mark arrows, report lost ground, and begin looking for the next position. Armies are trained to fear gaps because gaps become collapse. They become panic. They become rear areas full of vehicles moving the wrong way and commanders unable to understand where the front has gone. But the Hedgehog defense treated penetration differently. It did not welcome the enemy. No soldier in a trench welcomes a tank. But the system understood that an armored spearhead moving forward was not always the same as an army breaking through. A spearhead could outrun its infantry, could outrun its engineers, could lose contact with neighboring units. It could push into ground where its front looked strong but its sides became exposed. The idea was dangerous because it required discipline under pressure. Strongpoints had to keep fighting even when bypassed. Anti-tank guns had to hold fire until the right moment. Infantry had to stay in prepared positions while the noise of German engines moved around them. Mobile obstacle teams had to move into threatened areas and lay mines in paths already under observation. Artillery had to fire not only where the enemy was, but where he would be forced to go. To men raised on the idea of continuous front lines, this could look reckless. Why allow tanks to pass between positions? Why not pull back before being surrounded? Why leave small groups exposed? Because the goal was not to preserve a beautiful line on a map. The goal was to break the attack's shape. Imagine a German armored column moving through what appears to be a gap. The lead tanks push forward. The commander reports progress. Behind them, the path narrows. Mines force vehicles into lanes. A strong point on the left, not fully reduced, begins firing into support troops. A gun on the right waits for side armor. Soviet artillery lands behind the spearhead, not always to destroy the tanks, but to make the infantry hesitate. Engineers called forward to clear the next obstacle cannot arrive quickly because the route behind is under fire. Now the spearhead is still moving, but it is no longer whole. That was the cruel intelligence of the Hedgehog. It made movement look possible, then made support difficult. It allowed the attacker to believe he was solving the first problem while the second and third were already forming. For the German crews, this created a particular kind of unease. They could see destroyed Soviet positions and still feel surrounded by danger. They could pass a trench and wonder whether men inside it were dead, hiding, or waiting. They could watch a minefield being cleared and know that more mines might be laid behind them. The battlefield no longer had a clean front and rear. Threat came from angles. This mattered because German armored warfare depended not only on firepower, but on confidence. The confidence to advance. The confidence to exploit gaps. The confidence that if a commander pushed forward, the rest of the machine would follow. The Hedgehog defense did not destroy that confidence in one blow. It wore it down. An officer might still order the advance. A driver might still obey. A gunner might still hit what he aimed at. But each new obstacle added hesitation. Each hidden gun made the next field suspicious. Each delay made the plan feel less like a plan and more like a negotiation with the ground. The Soviets paid dearly for this. Strong points were not magic. Men inside them died. Guns were knocked out. Trenches were crushed. Some positions vanished under German artillery and assault guns. To describe the defense as clever does not make it painless. Cleverness in war often means finding a way to make someone else suffer more while you still suffer terribly. But the system had a brutal advantage. It did not require every defender to survive. It required enough defenders to make the attacker spend more than he could afford. German commanders believed bypassed positions were defeated positions. What really happened was more complicated. Some bypassed positions remained alive behind the movement of the assault. They fired into flanks. They harassed supply. They called artillery. They forced German units to divert men and machines to problems that should have been finished. And every diversion mattered. The offensive at Kursk was not simply a question of whether German tanks could punch holes. They could. The question was whether they could punch through fast enough, deep enough, and with enough strength left to exploit the damage. The Hedgehog defense was designed to answer no, not by stopping every vehicle at the first ditch, but by making each forward movement less useful than it looked. So when German tanks entered the belts, the first reports could still sound optimistic. Ground gained. Resistance heavy but overcome. Mines cleared. Strong point reduced. But beneath those words, another story was forming. Fuel burned. Tracks broke. Engineers fell behind. Infantry lost contact. Crews grew tired. Commanders waited for reports that arrived too late or incomplete. The spearhead was still sharp. But the Hedgehog did not need to blunt it all at once. It only needed to make the spearhead bleed before it reached the heart. The test under fire. Minefields in front, guns on the flanks. By mid-morning, the first neatness of the attack had begun to disappear. The battlefield had become a place of dust and noise. Engines ran hot. Artillery smoke drifted low over the ground, clinging to depressions and folds in the land. Tank commanders stood half-exposed in open hatches when they dared, trying to see beyond the narrow blindness of steel. Some dropped back inside as soon as shell fragments began snapping through the air. Ahead, the minefields waited without movement. That was what made them unnerving. A gun fired. Plane screamed. A shell announced itself with a sound men learned to recognize. But a mine was silent until the moment it was not. It lay beneath ordinary dirt. It gave no warning. It turned the ground into a question. German engineers moved first. They had trained for this. They were not amateurs. They understood mines, obstacles, wire, anti-tank ditches. They carried detectors, probes, explosives, markers. They crawled, knelt, signaled, advanced by inches when necessary. Under calm conditions, such work demanded patience. Under fire, patience became a kind of courage few men watching from behind could fully understand. A shell landed nearby, lifting dirt into the air. Men ducked. Someone shouted. The engineer closest to the lane did not run. He waited for the fragments to pass, then reached forward again. Behind him, tanks waited in line. Waiting is dangerous for armor. A moving tank is hard to hit. A waiting tank becomes part of the landscape. Soviet observers watched for congestion. Artillery batteries adjusted. Mortars began to search the lane. Anti-tank guns stayed hidden until the moment promised by training and fear. Then one fired. The first burst might miss. The second might strike a vehicle not at the front but halfway down the column. That was enough. Men turned optics toward the flash. Another gun fired from a different angle. Commander shouted for suppression. Machine guns opened. Shells struck earthworks. The air filled with dust so thick that men could no longer tell whether they were hitting the gun that had fired or only the ground around it. The Soviet gun crew knew their chances. They understood that firing revealed them. They understood that German return fire could crush their pit within minutes. But minutes were the currency of the defense. If they could make the German column halt, deploy, and answer, they had already changed the battle. In some sectors, German vehicles did get through. This must be said plainly. The Hedgehog defense was not an iron wall. German skill and violence mattered. Mines were cleared. Guns were knocked out. Positions were overrun. Soviet soldiers were killed in their trenches, and German crews sometimes forced their way through scenes that would have broken less experienced men. But forcing a way through is not the same as breaking free. A tank that crossed the first minefield entered the next problem. A gun that destroyed one anti-tank position exposed itself to another. Infantry advancing behind armor found that the strongpoint believed to be suppressed still had a machine gun alive in a side trench. Engineers who cleared a path forward discovered mines appearing again where mobile Soviet teams had worked under cover of smoke and shellfire. The ground seemed to repair its own danger. For German commanders, the frustration was not only physical. It was mental. The attack did not fail cleanly. It resisted interpretation. One report said progress. Another called for engineers. A third described heavy resistance from a position already marked as taken. A fourth asked for artillery against guns that no one could locate. A fifth reported vehicles disabled by mines in a lane thought to be cleared. War becomes exhausting when the same problem returns wearing a different face. Inside one German tank, the crew might hear the radio crackle with instructions to move left, then stop, then wait for clearance, then engage a target at the edge of visibility. The driver's shoulders ache from tension. The gunner's eyes burn. The loader works in a cramped rhythm of shell, breach, recoil, shell, breach, recoil. The commander tries to build a picture from fragments. Outside, Soviet infantry stay low in the earth. Dirt falls from trench walls with every impact. A young soldier grips his rifle or anti-tank weapon and waits for a machine he can hear before he sees it. An older sergeant tells him not to fire yet. Not yet. Let it come closer. That waiting is almost unbearable. When the moment arrives, it arrives fast. A tank appears through smoke. Too close now. Larger than it looked in training. The sergeant gives the word. A gun fires. Or a bottle is thrown. Or an anti-tank rifle cracks. Or artillery comes down on the lane behind the vehicle, cutting it away from the men who were meant to protect it. The Germans had expected resistance. What many did not fully expect was the way resistance could be layered until every solution opened another wound. The first belts could be breached, yes, but every breach had a price written in steel, fuel, time, and nerves. And the deeper the attack moved, the more important that price became. Because at Kursk, the measure of success was not whether a German tank could enter the Soviet defense. It was whether it could still matter when it came out the other side. Battlefield reality. The breakthrough that became attrition. From a distance, the German attack could still look like movement. Lines shifted. Villages changed hands. Reports spoke of penetrations, destroyed guns, prisoners taken, minefields crossed. Officers at headquarters marked advances and studied the next objective. The language of progress remained available. But on the ground, progress had become heavy. This is one of the hardest truths of Kursk to hold clearly. The Germans did not simply drive forward and collapse. They fought hard. In places, they advanced. Their armor was dangerous. Their officers were experienced. Their artillery and aircraft could still punish Soviet formations with terrifying force. No serious account should pretend that German strength vanished when the first mine exploded. The more unsettling truth is that strength was being consumed while it was still functioning. That is what attrition often looks like from inside a battle. Not immediate failure, not surrender, not a sudden silence. Instead, a capable force continues to fight while becoming less capable by the hour. A battalion still exists, but fewer vehicles are running. A company still reports forward movement, but its infantry is delayed. A regiment still attacks, but its timetable is gone. A commander still has options, but every option is narrower than it was at dawn. The Hedgehog defense turned German success into expenditure. A strong point overrun cost ammunition and time. A minefield crossed cost engineers and vehicles. A gun destroyed cost exposure. A trench cleared cost infantry. A lane opened became a target for artillery. A tank recovered today might not return in time for the attack that needed it now. For the men inside German armor, this meant the battle became less like a charge and more like grinding through a machine built to damage confidence. The crew might destroy one gun and immediately hear of another. They might see Soviet soldiers retreat from one trench and then receive fire from a position behind it. They might believe they had passed the worst ground only to find another belt waiting, less visible but no less dangerous. Somewhere in this process, the emotional center of the offensive changed. At the start, men ask, how fast can we break through? Later, they ask, how much more of this is ahead? That question is poison to momentum. The Soviets had prepared for this psychological transition as much as the physical one. Defense in depth does not only absorb attacks. It teaches the attacker that the first victory does not mean what he hoped it meant. The first trench is not the position. The first belt is not the defense. The first minefield is not the last. Every time the attacker believes he has solved the problem, the battlefield reveals another part of the system. German commanders believed the decisive question was whether Soviet lines could be pierced. The battlefield answered with a different question. What would be left of the attackers after piercing them? This was where the old belief in armored decision began to come apart. Tanks could still win local fights. They could still crush guns, overrun trenches, and terrify men. But they could not, by themselves, restore the lost conditions of blitzkrieg. Surprise was gone. The Soviets knew where the blow was coming. Space was prepared. Reserves waited. Artillery was registered. Mines were not scattered randomly. They were part of a larger design. Movement continued, but it no longer carried the same promise. A German officer looking at a map might see a penetration several miles deep and still feel unease. The flank was not secure. The follow-up forces were not where they needed to be. Soviet resistance had not dissolved. The next defensive belt was already being reported. Time was passing, and time favored the side that had prepared depth. On the Soviet side, no one experienced this as effortless victory. Command posts received their own terrible reports. Positions lost. Guns knocked out. Casualties mounting. Some units taking punishment beyond what anyone could calmly describe. There was fear there too. There was confusion. There were commanders wondering whether the line would hold and soldiers wondering whether the next shape in the smoke would be the one they could not stop. But the difference lay in expectation. The Soviets had built a battle that assumed pain. The Germans had built a plan that required speed through pain. When the pain lasted too long, the plan suffered more. That is the moment the Hedgehog defense began to reveal its real power. It did not need to produce a clean, cinematic reversal. It did not need one dramatic stroke. Its victory was cumulative, almost bureaucratic in its cruelty. A disabled tank here. A delayed engineer unit there. A strong point still firing behind the first wave. A reserve moved into place because the Germans had lost an hour. Another minefield. Another pause. Another call over the radio. By itself, each event seemed manageable. Together, they changed the battle. The German offensive still had teeth. But teeth can break if forced to bite stone for long enough. And the Soviets had filled the ground with stone. The mathematics of survival: 1 mine, 1 minute, 1 lost tank. The numbers of Kursk can become overwhelming if handled carelessly. Mines laid. Trenches dug. Guns deployed. Tanks committed. Vehicles damaged. Men killed, wounded, missing. Every figure carries weight, but numbers in war often become strangely bloodless. They look clean on a page because the mud has been wiped away. What matters here is not only the number. It is what the number reveals. A single mine disabling one lead tank could stop more than one vehicle. Could block a lane. A blocked lane could hold up a platoon. A held-up platoon could delay a company. A delayed company could leave infantry exposed, or prevent artillery observers from moving, or force engineers into the open. From the air, this might look like a small pause in a large battle. Inside the timetable of an offensive, it could become a wound. The Hedgehog defense worked through multiplication. One obstacle rarely decided anything alone. But one obstacle covered by fire became a tactical problem. Several such obstacles became a delay. Several delays became a loss of rhythm. Loss of rhythm became vulnerability. Vulnerability forced caution. Caution consumed the offensive from within. This was the mathematics German commanders could not solve with heavier armor alone. A Tiger could survive hits that would destroy a lighter tank. A Ferdinand could mount a powerful gun. A Panther, despite its early mechanical troubles, represented serious ambition in armored design. These machines mattered. They were not illusions. But none of them could make a minefield disappear. None could make infantry instantly catch up. None could make a damaged track repair itself under shellfire. None could restore an hour lost at dawn. War is full of these small tyrannies. A commander may think in kilometers, but a driver thinks in meters. A general may think in divisions, but a recovery crew thinks in cables, hooks, mud, and whether enemy artillery has found the wreck. A staff officer may count tanks available at sunrise, but by afternoon the more important category is different. Tanks running, tanks immobilized, tanks reparable, tanks blocking the route, tanks whose crews are alive but shaken, tanks still on paper but absent from the next attack. The Hedgehog defense turned available into a complicated word. A damaged tank might not be destroyed. It might be recoverable. It might return tomorrow. But if the attack needed it today, tomorrow was not enough. A crew might survive a mine blast, climb out, and be reassigned. But the vehicle was still not moving. A mine-clearing team might eventually open a path. But the enemy artillery had used the delay to adjust. A strong point might eventually fall. But the Soviet reserves had gained time. Kursk time was not neutral. Every hour the Germans spent fighting through prepared belts gave the Soviets more chances to shift, reinforce, observe, and counter. Every hour also drained German fuel, ammunition, mechanical reliability, and human endurance. Engines overheated. Tracks wore. Crews grew slower. Commanders became less certain. Men who had begun the day as part of a confident offensive became men waiting for the next obstruction. In this kind of battle, survival itself becomes mathematical. A Soviet anti-tank crew knew that firing too soon reduced the chance of a kill. Waiting increased danger. The closer the tank came, the better the shot, and the less time the crew had to live if they missed. A combat engineer laying mines under fire knew that one mine in the right place might save a position, while one mistake might kill a comrade. A German driver knew that following the vehicle ahead did not guarantee safety. The next meter of earth belonged to chance and enemy preparation. Reports later tried to account for these things through losses and advances. They had to. Armies require numbers. But the battlefield's deeper calculation was felt in the body. A man who has spent 6 hours in a tank under artillery fire does not fight the 7th hour like he fought the first. A gun crew that has watched 2 neighboring pits go silent does not wait with calm hearts for the next target. An engineer crawling into a lane already struck by shells knows that the problem before him is not abstract. The German command had counted on concentration. The Soviet defense answered with distribution. Instead of placing hope in one perfect blow, it spread danger across space. Mines in one place, guns in another, infantry in trenches, artillery registered on likely lanes, strong points able to support one another. Reserves behind them. The attacker could solve one piece, then another, but each solution cost something. That was the real mathematics of survival. Not the beauty of a formula, but the accumulation of costs. One mine, 1 minute, one stopped tank, then the next. And somewhere in that accumulation, a powerful armored offensive began to discover that it could still advance and still be losing what it needed most. Human cost. Inside the stopped machine. Inside a disabled tank, time changes shape. The first moment is impact. A blast under the track. A violent lift. Metal screaming against metal. Men thrown against hard surfaces. Someone curses. Someone checks whether he can still move his legs. The engine may keep running for a few seconds, as if the machine has not understood what happened to it. Then the crew listens. Listening is part of survival. Is there fire? Is ammunition cooking off? Is the radio alive? Is the enemy firing? Can the turret still turn? Can the driver reverse? Is the track gone? Can they stay inside? Or must they climb out into a field that has been waiting for them? There is no glory in that moment. Only procedure and fear. A tank can look invulnerable from the outside and feel terribly small from within. The air grows hot. Smoke irritates the eyes. Every hit sounds closer than it may be. A shell striking nearby can ring through the hull like a hammer against a coffin lid. Men speak in short phrases because long sentences are too much. Tracks gone. Radio. Smoke. Get down. On the Soviet side, the men who caused the stop may not feel triumph. An anti-tank crew that disables a vehicle still has to survive the answer. German guns turn quickly. Machine gun fire tears at the earth around the pit. Shells smash camouflage, branches, sandbags, bodies. The gun commander may know they have done what they were asked to do and still know that the next minutes may kill them. War does not always give men time to understand the importance of their actions. A Soviet engineer laying mines during the battle might see a German tank burning in the distance and feel no victory, only urgency. More mines, more markers, more obstacles before the next wave. His hands are dirty, his ears ring. He may not have slept properly in days. Somewhere behind him, wounded men are being carried back through trenches too narrow for haste. The medics see the battle differently from everyone. They do not see arrows, belts, or strongpoints. They see what arrives after theory has done its work. Burns, shrapnel, crushed limbs, men deaf from blast, men who ask for water, men who ask where their friend is, men who do not ask anything because they are staring at a place no one else can see. The human cost of the Hedgehog defense was not one-sided. German tank crews burned, suffocated, bled, and waited helplessly in immobilized vehicles. Soviet gun crews were killed in pits they had dug themselves. Engineers died trying to keep the ground dangerous. Infantrymen disappeared under barrages meant to clear positions before tanks arrived. Civilians who had helped build defenses lived with the knowledge that their fields had become killing grounds. A serious documentary must hold both truths at once. The German commanders who believed in armored breakthrough were wrong about what the battlefield would allow. But the men inside the tanks were not symbols. Many were young. Many were skilled. Many were afraid. Some believed what they had been told because experience had taught them it could be true. Some had already seen enough war to believe nothing except the next order. The Soviet defenders were not simple heroes carved from stone. They were exhausted men doing work that often meant dying in place. Some held. Some broke. Some fired too early. Some waited long enough. Some were never found. Their courage was not clean, and that is why it feels real. In the stopped machine, belief had little use. A German crewman did not need a theory of defense in depth to understand that the attack had slowed. He knew because he was sitting inside a tank that could no longer move. A Soviet gunner did not need a lecture on operational attrition to know his shot mattered. He knew because the tank in front of him had stopped, and because the next one was coming. This is where the story of Hedgehog defense becomes more than doctrine. It becomes a story of men forced into terrible nearness. Machines brought them together. Mines fixed them in place. Guns made seconds enormous. Orders written far behind the line became physical facts in the hands of crews, drivers, engineers, and medics. Later, someone would count the vehicles. Someone would count the ground gained. Someone would count the casualties. But no report could fully count the cost of waiting inside a vehicle that might burn, or holding a gun position until the tank filled the site, or crawling into a mine lane because the entire column behind you could not move until you did. The Hedgehog defense bled tanks dry. It also bled men. And when the smoke began to clear, the surviving commanders were left with a question more difficult than any number. If the tanks had done so much damage and still failed to decide the battle, what had changed? Delayed realization, reports after the smoke cleared. After battle, armies try to turn chaos into language. They write reports. They list losses. They mark objectives. They explain delays. They describe resistance as heavy, moderate, stubborn, unexpected. They record damaged vehicles, ammunition expenditure, enemy positions, artillery concentrations, minefields, and the performance of new equipment. The sentences are often dry because they have to be. A report cannot tremble, cannot smell smoke. It cannot admit confusion in the same way a man in a tank feels it. But sometimes the truth enters through the dryness. Around Kursk, the truth was this. The German offensive had not achieved what it needed to achieve. It had hurt the Red Army. It had taken ground. It had shown, again, that German tactical skill and armored force remained dangerous. But it had not restored the old war of movement. It had not shattered Soviet command. It had not created the decisive collapse that the operation required. The Soviets had absorbed the blow. Absorbed does not mean escaped harm. It means the blow did not produce the intended result. That distinction mattered. German commanders could point to local successes, destroyed guns, penetrated belts, and brave actions by crews and units. None of that was false, but the larger reality remained. Every success had cost too much time, too much strength, too much mechanical wear, too much coordination. Recognition came slowly because institutions rarely abandon their deepest beliefs in a single morning. The German army had invested more than equipment at Kursk. It had invested faith in a method. The idea that concentrated armor could regain control of events was not merely tactical. It was emotional. It promised that the disasters of the previous year did not have the final word. The battlefield gave a quieter answer. Heavy armor could improve a local fight, could not undo strategic conditions. Better guns could kill more effectively. They could not make surprise return. More steel could protect crews in some moments. It could not protect an offensive from delay, mines, defensive depth, Soviet reserves, and the widening imbalance of the war. Some realizations arrive not as revelations, but as fatigue. A commander reads a report and sees that too many vehicles require repair. Another sees that infantry strength has fallen. Another sees that objectives were taken later than planned. Another sees that Soviet resistance is still organized where it should have been collapsing. No single line says the old belief is dead, but the accumulation says it. The Hedgehog defense had forced Germany to confront an uncomfortable truth. It was possible to win fights inside the battle and still lose the battle's purpose. This is why Kursk became so heavy in memory. Not because every popular story about it is simple or uncontested. Not because the numbers are always easy. They are not. Historians still debate details, losses, interpretations, and emphasis. But the operational meaning is hard to escape. After Kursk, Germany did not regain the strategic initiative in the east. The Red Army would keep pressing. The war would move westward. For the Soviet side, recognition also came with complications. The defense had worked, but at enormous cost. Soviet commanders could praise the system, but the men who made the system real had paid in blood. Mine belts and strongpoints were not abstract successes. They were places where human beings had been crushed, burned, buried, and forgotten. Some were recognized. Many were not. The names remembered from great battles are rarely proportional to the work that shaped them. A marshal may be known. An army commander may be studied. A tank model may become famous. But the engineer who laid mines at night, the gun crew that held fire until the last possible moment, the infantryman who stayed in a bypass trench, these figures often dissolve into the phrase Soviet defenses. That phrase is too small. It hides hands, fear, mud, breath, and judgment. It hides the soldier who adjusted camouflage on a gun barrel for the third time because a careless branch might give the position away. It hides the man carrying ammunition through shellfire. It hides the officer who understood that the map looked worse than the situation, or better than the situation, depending on which trench was still alive. German commanders had believed the Hedgehog defense was something to be broken. The reports after Kursk suggested something else. It had been something to be spent against. And Germany, already stretched by a war too large for its resources, could no longer afford that kind of spending. The lesson was not that tanks had become useless. The lesson was colder. Tanks still mattered. But tanks could no longer rescue a strategy that had run out of room for error. Legacy, the defense that turned momentum against itself. Kursk did not end armored warfare. That would be too easy, and it would be wrong. Tanks continued to matter. They would matter across Europe, across the Eastern Front, in offensives, counteroffensives, breakthroughs, pursuits, and desperate defensive stands. Steel, firepower, and mobility remained central to modern war. But Kursk changed the meaning of confidence. Before, a commander might look at armored mass and imagine decision. After battles like Kursk, he had to ask harder questions. Where is surprise? Where is the infantry? How deep is the enemy defense? Who clears the mines? How many belts? How many reserves? How much time can be lost before the plan stops being the plan? The Hedgehog defense left a lesson that reached beyond one field and one summer. Prepared defense could turn the attacker's greatest strength against him. Momentum, if forced into narrow lanes and repeated pauses, could become vulnerability. Armor, if separated from support, could become isolated strength. Penetration, if not followed by exploitation, could become a deeper form of entanglement. The old image of war as a contest between attack and defense was not enough. At Kursk, defense attacked the attack. It struck at movement, timing, confidence, coordination, and endurance. It did not merely wait behind wire. It shaped the battlefield so that the enemy's preferred method became harder to use with every kilometer. That is why the story remains worth telling. Not because one side discovered a perfect answer. There are no perfect answers in war. Every defense has gaps. Every strong point can fall. Every minefield can be cleared. Every gun crew can be killed. The Hedgehog defense was not invincible. It was costly, brutal, and dependent on men staying in positions where survival was uncertain. Its power lay in forcing the enemy to pay repeatedly. Modern readers and viewers sometimes want war to have clean lessons. Build this weapon. Use this tactic. Avoid this mistake. But the lesson of the Hedgehog defense is more uncomfortable. It says that systems defeat myths. It says that a weapon's reputation matters less than the conditions under which it must operate. It says that courage and technology both become limited when the ground, time, and enemy preparation are arranged against them. German commanders had believed in the Panzer as the instrument that could restore decision. What really happened at Kursk was not the death of the tank, but the exposure of its dependence. A tank needed a world around it. When that world was broken, when lanes were mined, infantry pinned, engineers targeted, artillery registered, and strong points still firing from unexpected angles, even the most powerful machine became part of a larger problem. The legacy also belongs to the unnamed. The engineer with a mine crate, the gunner waiting in a pit, the infantryman holding a trench already half collapsed, the medic moving through smoke after the tanks passed, the mechanic trying to recover a damaged vehicle before artillery found it again. War history often moves toward generals because generals leave papers. But battle is also shaped by people whose decisions last longer than their names. A mine placed well can change a morning. A gun held silent can change a column. A trench held for 10 more minutes can change a timetable. And a timetable, in war, can decide whether an offensive arrives with strength or arrives already bleeding. This is why the Hedgehog defense should not be remembered as dirt and wire alone. It was patience weaponized. It was fear disciplined into preparation. It was the understanding that sometimes the way to stop a powerful enemy is not to meet him with one dramatic blow, but to make him lose certainty step by step. By the time German armor reached deeper into the Soviet belts, Many crews had already fought several battles inside one battle. Against mines, against guns, against smoke, against delays, against the awful feeling that every field ahead had been prepared by someone who knew they were coming. The machines were still loud, but the old promise of speed had grown quieter. Closing reflection. What they believed. What really happened. Return to the morning. July 5, 1943. The dim light. The engines. The radio static. The commander inside the tank waiting for the order to move. The smell of oil and hot metal. The belief, not foolish but incomplete, that enough armor, properly concentrated, could still break open the Eastern Front. Ahead of him, the field looked empty. That was the final deception. It was not empty. It had been studied, measured, dug, wired, mined, ranged, and remembered by men who understood that the German attack would need speed more than anything else. Beneath the grass were mines. Behind the folds of earth were guns. Inside the trenches were soldiers trying not to think too far ahead. Behind them were more belts, more reserves, more artillery, more waiting. The Hedgehog defense did not look impressive in the way a tank looked impressive. It had no single silhouette, no polished armor, no engine note, no clean photograph that could explain its power. It was a collection of ugly things placed with purpose. Earth, wire, mines, guns, ditches, pits, signals, maps, tired hands, and men willing to stay where the fire would come. German commanders believed such defenses could be crushed by force and skill. There was reason for that belief. They had crushed defenses before. They had seen armies unravel when armor broke through. They had watched speed create panic faster than headquarters could react. Their confidence came from experience, and experience can be dangerous when it teaches the right lesson for the wrong battlefield. Kursk, the battlefield had changed. The Soviets did not need to prove that German tanks were weak. They were not weak. They did not need to stop every attack at the first line. They often could not. They did not need every strong point to survive. Many did not. They needed something simpler and harder. They needed the German spearheads to arrive late. They needed them damaged, delayed, separated, and tired. They needed commanders to spend the morning solving problems that should not have existed. They needed engineers in the open, infantry pinned behind armor, recovery crews under fire, and tank commanders wondering why each new field felt like another trap. The Hedgehog did not chase the tanks. It waited. And waiting, when organized by men who understood the enemy's needs, became a weapon. The cost was terrible. It was paid in burned vehicles, shattered gun pits, bodies in trenches, engineers killed over silent mines, medics carrying men whose names would not survive the reports. No doctrine should be allowed to hide that. No clever tactical phrase should make the suffering smaller. But the truth of the battle remains. They believed steel and speed would break the Hedgehog. But what really happened was that the Hedgehog broke the rhythm of steel and speed. It turned momentum into delay, delay into exposure, exposure into loss, and loss into a realization that arrived too late. War often burns away theory. At Kursk, in the smoke between the minefields and the guns, one theory burned slowly. That armored power, by itself, could force reality to obey. Reality did not obey. It waited in the ground. If you watched this story to the end, write in the comments where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war on any front in any uniform, you are welcome to share their name or their story below. These histories are not only made by generals and machines, but by people who endured moments the rest of us can only try to understand. Subscribe to WW2 Warfront for more forgotten stories from the Second World War, what they believed and what really happened.